There's a specific kind of quiet, low-grade misery that almost nobody talks about directly, because admitting to it feels embarrassing, almost childish, and yet it shapes an enormous amount of daily emotional life for a huge number of people. It's a feeling that arrives, uninvited, while scrolling the feed of other people's carefully selected highlights, or sitting in a meeting where a colleague announces a promotion, or catching up with an old friend who mentions, casually, a house they just bought, a relationship that seems effortless, a body that looks the way yours used to, or the way you've always wished it did. In that moment, something in you deflates just slightly, and a voice starts up comparing, measuring, calculating exactly how far behind you apparently are relative to someone else's apparent position on some imaginary scoreboard you never consciously agreed to compete on, but that seemed to run constantly in the background anyway. This feeling is old enough that the Stoics wrote about it extensively under various names: envy, jealousy, the corrosive habit of measuring your own life against someone else's, and their diagnosis of what's actually happening in that moment of deflation is sharper and more useful than most modern advice on the subject, precisely because it doesn't simply tell you to stop feeling what you're feeling. It explains with real precision why the comparison itself is structurally broken from the start, built on information you don't actually have, applied to a scoreboard that was never a legitimate measure of anything real in the first place. Let's start with the mechanics of comparison itself, because understanding exactly how it operates is most of the work in learning to interrupt it. When you compare your life to someone else's, what you are actually comparing is your own complete, richly detailed internal experience, every doubt, every private struggle, every 3 a.m. worry, every mundane frustration nobody else witnesses, against a radically incomplete, carefully curated external presentation of someone else's life, the small slice they've chosen, consciously or unconsciously, to show you. This is true even outside social media, even in ordinary in-person interactions. But social media has taken an already unfair comparison and industrialized it, optimized it, turned the selective presentation of a life's highlights into a genuine, sophisticated craft that an enormous number of people are now unconsciously competing in, without realizing quite how skewed the competition actually is. Epictetus, teaching centuries before any of this technology existed, was nonetheless extraordinarily precise about the underlying structural problem, because the problem isn't really about technology at all. It's about a much older feature of how human judgment tends to malfunction. He taught that a great deal of human suffering comes specifically from comparing your own situation, which you experience completely and from the inside, against other people's situations, which you can only ever observe partially and from the outside. This asymmetry, he argued, makes almost every comparison a rigged one from the start, structurally incapable of producing an accurate picture, regardless of how the comparison happens to come out. You know everything about your own doubts, your own compromises, your own private failures. You know almost nothing equivalent about the person you're comparing yourself to, and the gap in information is not a minor detail. It's the entire reason the comparison feels so consistently unfavorable to whoever is doing the comparing. Think about how this actually plays out with something concrete. Picture someone scrolling past a photo of an old classmate on a beautiful vacation, looking relaxed, tanned, surrounded by what appears to be a loving family. Everyone smiling, the whole scene bathed in soft evening light. The scroller, sitting on a couch after a long, difficult day, feels a familiar deflation. Look how well their life is going, and look at mine. But notice everything this comparison is quietly assuming without any actual evidence. It assumes the vacation represents the classmate's actual, ongoing emotional state, rather than a single carefully chosen moment out of what might have been a stressful, expensive, logistically exhausting trip involving arguments in the car and a child who wouldn't stop crying at the airport. It assumes the visible marital or family harmony in the photo reflects the full texture of that relationship, rather than a single good hour captured deliberately because it was, in fact, unusually good, precisely because it stood out from more ordinary, less photogenic baseline. It assumes, essentially, that a single frozen frame, selected specifically because it was the most flattering option available, represents an accurate cross-section of an entire life, while the scroller's own comparison point is a complete, unedited, frequently unflattering totality of everything they know about themselves, including all the moments nobody would ever choose to photograph. This is not a comparison of like against like. It is structurally a comparison of a highlight reel against raw, unedited footage, and Epictetus' argument is that no amount of psychological resilience or positive thinking actually fixes this problem at the level where it's actually broken, because the problem isn't in how you're feeling about the comparison. It's in the comparison itself being fundamentally, structurally invalid from the outset. You are not, in any meaningful sense, actually measuring your life against someone else's life when you do this. You are measuring your complete inner experience against a curated fragment, and no fragment, however carefully selected, can ever function as an honest stand-in for someone else's complete inner experience, which remains, by definition, entirely invisible to you. This problem long predates any digital feed, and the Stoics had watched it operate in the fully offline world of Roman public life, where reputation and status were displayed just as selectively as any modern profile, simply through different means: public offices held, houses built, processions staged, generosity performed in front of an audience specifically chosen to notice it. Seneca, in his letters, describes watching wealthy Romans grow visibly miserable despite genuinely enormous fortunes, precisely because their attention stayed locked on a handful of people whose fortunes happened to be larger still, rather than on a vastly larger number of people who would have considered their own circumstances a wildly unattainable dream. He observed that this particular kind of unhappiness had nothing to do with actual material lack and everything to do with where attention was being deliberately, if unconsciously, pointed. A person surrounded by genuine abundance can still manage to feel impoverished reliably, simply by choosing, out of habit rather than necessity, to keep their gaze fixed exclusively on whoever currently stands one rung higher. There's a second layer to this problem that Seneca addressed with particular sharpness, one that goes beyond simply not having full information, into a deeper claim about why the entire comparative framework is misguided even when you do happen to have relatively complete information about someone else's circumstances. Seneca observed that people tend to compare themselves specifically against those who appear to be doing better, rarely against a much larger number of people doing considerably worse, and that this elective direction of comparison guarantees a consistently unflattering result, regardless of how objectively good the comparer's own circumstances actually are. He pointed out that no matter how much a person has, wealth, status, health, relationships, there will always exist someone somewhere who appears to have more, and that a mind trained to habitually measure itself against whoever currently holds a more advantageous position will never, under any circumstances, arrive at a stable sense of sufficiency, regardless of how much that person's actual circumstances objectively improve over time. This is worth sitting with, because it explains something that otherwise seems genuinely puzzling. Why does comparison-driven dissatisfaction so often persist, or even worsen, precisely as a person's actual circumstances improve? Someone earns promotion they wanted for years, and within a matter of weeks, the satisfaction fades, replaced by a new comparison, this time against colleagues at an even higher level, whose lives now occupy the position of the enviable comparison point, exactly the role previously filled by the position this person just successfully achieved. Someone finally buys a larger home they've been saving toward, and within months finds themselves noticing with quiet dissatisfaction the even larger homes in a more upscale neighborhood nearby, a comparison that would have seemed completely irrelevant before the move, but that now occupies exactly the same psychological position the previous home once did relative to some other, still more impressive home. Seneca's analysis of this pattern is unflinching. As long as satisfaction is defined relative to whoever currently holds a more advantageous position, satisfaction becomes structurally impossible to achieve on a lasting basis, because a comparison point simply relocates itself automatically and immediately the instant the previous gap closes, regardless of how much actual, objective improvement has occurred. So what is the actual alternative? If simply stop comparing yourself to others is easier said than done, which it obviously is, given how automatic and deeply conditioned this habit tends to be for almost everyone raised inside a culture saturated with ranking, status, and visible measures of relative success, the Stoic answer is not to eliminate the comparative instinct entirely, since some capacity for comparison and self-assessment is genuinely useful, part of how humans learn and improve. The answer is to redirect the comparison toward the one reference point that is actually available to you with full, complete information, and that is therefore capable of producing an honest, useful result rather than a structurally rigged one, your own past self. This reframe deserves careful unpacking, because it's easy to hear, compare yourself to your past self instead of others as a piece of generic self-help wisdom, the kind of thing that sounds nice printed on a poster, but doesn't actually change much in practice. The Stoic version of this idea carries more specific weight, because it's grounded in the exact same underlying logic that explains why comparison to others fails in the first place. You have complete, accurate information about your own past, not a curated highlight reel, but the actual, full texture of what you were dealing with, what you knew, what resources and support you had access to, what your genuine starting conditions actually were. This means comparison between your current self and your past self is, for the first time, actually a fair comparison, apples to apples, rather than structurally rigged comparison of your complete inner life against someone else's carefully edited fragment. Marcus Aurelius, in his private writing, returned repeatedly to a version of the same redirection, reminding himself that his task was to focus entirely on his own character, his own effort, his own progress, rather than spending his limited attention monitoring and measuring himself against the people around him, many of whom, as emperor, held positions of apparent status and success that could easily have provided endless material for exactly the kind of comparison Seneca warned against. Marcus's version of this discipline carries an added layer of specificity worth noting. He wasn't simply advising indifference to others' circumstances in some vague, generic sense. He was making precise claim about where genuinely useful information for self-improvement actually lives. Comparing yourself to a stranger's curated highlight reel gives you almost no useful information about how to actually improve your own life, because you're comparing against a target you don't actually understand. Comparing your current self honestly against your own past self, by contrast, gives you extremely specific, actionable information. What have I actually learned? Where have I genuinely grown? Where am I still repeating patterns I recognized from years ago? What would a version of me from 3 years back think of how I'm handling things now? These are answerable questions, grounded in information you actually possess, unlike the unanswerable question of how your inner experience truly compares to someone else's inner experience, which you can never actually access no matter how much of the curated exterior you observe. It's worth noting that this was not, for Marcus, a purely abstract exercise. As emperor, he was surrounded constantly by exactly the kind of visible status markers most likely to trigger comparison in almost anyone. Generals returning from successful campaigns, wealthy senators displaying their fortunes, provincial governors competing openly for his favor and attention. If comparison were simply a matter of circumstance, of having enough already, Marcus would have been about as immune to it as a human being could plausibly be, holding the single most powerful and materially secure position available anywhere in the known world at the time. And yet his own writing suggests he still had to actively, deliberately practice this redirection, still had to remind himself, apparently more than once, not to measure his own worth against the visible achievements of the people constantly surrounding him. This detail matters because it suggests the comparison habit is not simply a symptom of insufficient success or insufficient security, something that would presumably resolve itself once a person finally achieved enough. It's a habit of attention, independent of actual circumstances, which means it has to be addressed as a habit of attention through deliberate, repeated redirection, rather than through the accumulation of ever more external achievement, which, as Seneca's moving goalpost observation already demonstrated, was never actually going to resolve it on its own. Let's make this genuinely practical, because the shift from theory to actual daily habit is where this idea either becomes useful or remains simply an interesting thing to have heard once. The next time you notice that familiar deflation arriving, the comparison trigger dip that shows up while scrolling, while sitting in a meeting, while catching up with an old friend, try a specific, deliberate redirection rather than simply trying to suppress or ignore the feeling, which tends not to work particularly well as a strategy on its own. Notice the comparison happening, and then ask a different, more answerable question. Not, how do I measure up against this person? A question you structurally cannot answer with any accuracy, but how do I measure up against where I was a year ago, 2 years ago, 5 years ago? A question you actually have real, complete information to answer honestly. This redirection works especially well because it tends to reveal genuine progress that the comparison to others' habit systematically obscures. Someone caught in the comparison trap, measuring themselves constantly against people who appear to be doing better, can go years without ever noticing their own actual growth, because the goalposts keep moving, relocating themselves automatically to whoever currently holds a more advantageous position, exactly as Seneca described. The same person, redirected toward an honest comparison against their own documented past, often discovers, sometimes with genuine surprise, that they have in fact grown substantially, become measurably more capable, more resilient, more skilled, more at peace, in ways that were simply invisible under the old comparative framework, because that framework was never actually designed to track genuine personal growth in the first place. It was designed, structurally, to always find someone currently doing better, which means it will always find someone currently doing better, regardless of how much actual progress has occurred. It's worth being honest about one specific difficulty with this practice, because pretending it's simple would undersell how deeply the comparison habit tends to be conditioned into most people from a young age, often starting well before anyone develops the philosophical tools to examine it critically. Schools rank students against each other. Workplaces frequently structure advancement around comparative performance relative to colleagues. Social platforms are, quite literally, engineered by extremely sophisticated companies specifically to maximize exactly the kind of comparative engagement this entire discussion has been arguing against. Because comparison, uncomfortable as it feels, turns out to be remarkably effective at keeping people scrolling, checking, refreshing, in search of the next data point in an endless, unwinnable competition. Recognizing this doesn't make the habit disappear instantly, and it would be dishonest to suggest that simply hearing Epictetus' argument about the structural unfairness of comparison is enough, on its own, to permanently dissolve a pattern that's deeply reinforced by decades of cultural conditioning and, in the case of social media specifically, deliberate technological design. What this recognition does offer, though, is something genuinely useful, a specific, repeatable move to make the next time the familiar deflation arrives, rather than simply being carried along by it as though it were an accurate, trustworthy signal about your actual standing in the world. The move is not to eliminate the comparative instinct, which is probably not fully possible and might not even be desirable, since some capacity to notice what others are doing well can genuinely inform your own growth, when applied carefully and honestly. The move is to notice, specifically, when a comparison being drawn is the structurally rigged kind, your complete inner experience against someone else's curated fragment, and to consciously redirect it toward the one comparison that was always actually fair and always actually useful. The honest, complete, fully informed comparison between who you are now and who you were before, measured not against anyone else's finish line, but against your own actual starting point. Let's walk through a specific, composite scene to see this mechanism in slower, closer detail, because the abstract version of this idea tends to slide past without actually changing anything, while a concrete scene tends to stick. Picture two co-workers, both hired around the same time, both working in similar roles at the same company. Call one of them the comparer, because this particular habit runs unusually strong in her, not through any personal failing, simply through a lifetime of conditioning that happened to land especially deep. From her very first week, she has kept a kind of running, mostly unconscious ledger of how her own progress stacks up against her colleagues. When he gets assigned to a high-visibility project, she notices, and something in her deflates slightly, even though she genuinely likes him and would say, if asked directly, that she's happy for him. When she gets positive feedback on a piece of work, the good feeling lasts only until she happens to overhear him receiving equally positive feedback on something else, at which point her own accomplishment somehow feels smaller, diluted, as though there were only a fixed amount of professional worth available between the two of them, and every unit that went to him was a unit subtracted from her own account. Notice what's actually happening here, because it's a nearly perfect illustration of both Epictetus' structural point and Seneca's point about the moving goalpost. She does not and cannot actually know the full texture of her colleague's experience. She doesn't know about the anxiety he feels most Sunday nights, dreading the week ahead in ways he never mentions at the office. She doesn't know about the specific advantages he happened to walk in with, a mentor early in his career who opened doors hers didn't, a financial cushion from family that let him take career risks she couldn't afford to take. She doesn't know about his private frustrations, his own comparisons to people he considers further ahead than himself, comparisons that would probably astonish her if she could somehow see them, since from her vantage point, he looks like someone with very little left to want. What she's actually comparing, every single time this feeling arises, is her own complete, unfiltered inner experience, insecurities and all against a narrow, visible slice of his outward professional performance, the only part of him actually available for her to observe. And notice the second mechanism, too, the moving goalpost Seneca described. Suppose, hypothetically, this co-worker were to somehow overtake her colleague entirely, get promoted first, receive more visible recognition, become the more obviously successful one by every external measure she's been tracking. Would the comparing stop? Based on the pattern Seneca described, almost certainly not. The comparison would simply relocate itself to a new target, perhaps someone at a more senior level, perhaps someone at a different company entirely, someone whose apparent position now occupies exactly the role her original colleague's position used to occupy. The habit of comparison, once established, does not require any particular person to sustain itself. It simply needs anyone currently perceived as slightly ahead, and there will always, structurally, be such a person available, regardless of how far the comparer's own circumstances actually advance. Now imagine the same woman, a few years later, having genuinely internalized the Stoic redirection this episode has been describing, encountering the exact same situation, her colleague getting assigned to another high-visibility project. The old automatic deflation still arrives, at least at first, because deeply conditioned habits rarely disappear entirely just because you've understood the theory behind them. But now there's a second, deliberate move available immediately afterward. Instead of continuing to measure herself against her colleague's visible position, she redirects the question toward the comparison she actually has complete information for. How does her current work compare to her own work from 2 years ago? And here, using this honest, fully informed comparison, she typically finds something the old comparative habit had been hiding from her entirely. Genuine, substantial growth. Skills she didn't have 2 years ago. Confidence in meetings that used to terrify her. A body of completed work that, examined honestly against her own starting point rather than against someone else's current position, actually represents real, meaningful progress that had been invisible under the old framework precisely because that framework was never designed to notice it, only to notice whoever currently held a more advantageous position. This is worth pairing with a specific passage from Seneca's letters, paraphrased here rather than quoted at length, where he advises a friend to stop measuring his own progress against people who happen to be further along, and instead to look back at how far he has already traveled from where he began. Seneca makes an analogy to a traveler on a long journey, observing that a traveler who constantly measures the remaining distance against people who happen to be further down the road will always feel behind, always feel inadequate, regardless of how much actual ground they've covered, simply because there will always exist someone further along the same road. The traveler who instead looks back periodically at how far they've already come, compared to where they started, gets an entirely different, considerably more accurate, and considerably more encouraging picture of their own actual progress. Seneca's point here is not simply motivational fluff about staying positive. It's a precise, structural argument about which comparison actually yields usable, accurate information, and which comparison is mathematically guaranteed to produce a distorted, unfavorable result no matter how well the person is actually doing. There's a related idea worth pulling in here, one that Epictetus applied specifically to material possessions and status, but that extends naturally to almost any domain where comparison tends to creep in. He observed that wanting what someone else has, rather than working with genuine appreciation and effort toward your own circumstances, guarantees a kind of permanent poverty of spirit, regardless of a person's actual material situation. This is not a claim that ambition itself is bad, and it would badly misread Epictetus to hear it that way. He was not arguing against wanting to improve your circumstances, wanting a better job, more skill, deeper relationships, greater financial security. He was arguing against a very specific psychological orientation, wanting these things specifically because someone else has them, rather than because you've honestly examined what you actually want for your own life and are working toward on your own terms. The distinction matters enormously in practice. Ambition rooted in your own honestly examined values tends to produce sustained, durable motivation because the goal remains meaningful to you regardless of what anyone else is doing. Ambition rooted purely in comparison tends to produce exactly the moving goalpost problem Seneca described, since the target keeps relocating itself to wherever the currently most advantaged person happens to be standing, guaranteeing that satisfaction, even upon achieving the original goal, remains perpetually out of reach. Let's turn this into something genuinely actionable, a specific practice rather than simply an idea to nod along with. One version of this technique, drawn directly from the redirection Seneca and Marcus Aurelius both pointed toward, involves keeping a short, honest, periodic record of your own actual progress, reviewed specifically when a comparison habit flares up. This doesn't need to be elaborate. It might be as simple as, once every few months, writing down 3 or 4 specific things that are genuinely different, genuinely improved, compared to where you were a year earlier. Not vague generalities, but specific, honest, checkable claims. I handled difficult conversations with less anxiety than I used to. I built a specific skill I didn't have before. I repaired or deepened a relationship that used to be strained. The value of this record isn't in the writing itself, though the writing does help make the progress concrete rather than vague. The value is in having something honest and specific to consult the next time comparison habit flares up, so that instead of simply being carried along by the automatic, unfair comparison against someone else's curated fragment, you have an immediate, honest alternative reference point ready to redirect toward. A second, complementary technique involves a specific, deliberate pause the moment you notice the comparison-triggered deflation beginning, similar in spirit to the gap-widening practice at the heart of catching any automatic reaction before it runs its full course uninterrupted. The moment you notice a familiar dip, whether triggered by a social media post, a colleague's announcement, or simply a passing thought about someone else's apparent circumstances, pause long enough to name, explicitly, what information you actually have and don't have. Ask directly, What do I actually know about this person's full situation, their struggles, their private doubts, the specific advantages or disadvantages they started with, versus what am I assuming based on a narrow, curated fragment I happen to be able to see? In almost every case, this honest accounting reveals that the actual information available is remarkably thin, a handful of visible facts stretched to support a much larger, much more confident judgment than the evidence actually justifies. Naming this gap explicitly, out loud, or simply in your own head tends to drain a surprising amount of power from the comparison, not because the other person's success becomes less real, but because the specific, unfair comparison your mind had automatically constructed becomes visibly, obviously incomplete the moment you actually examine what it's built on. It's worth being honest that this practice, like most of the practical tools this channel keeps returning to, works through repetition rather than through a single moment of insight. The first time you catch a comparison trigger deflation and redirect it toward your own honest progress instead, it will likely feel effortful, deliberate, almost artificial, nothing like the smooth, effortless spiral the automatic comparison is replacing. This is normal, and it mirrors exactly the kind of gradual, unglamorous strengthening the Stoics described in every other domain of self-examination they wrote about. The automatic comparison habit had years, in most cases decades, of essentially unopposed practice to become as smooth and effortless as it currently is. The redirection toward honest self-comparison is, by contrast, a genuinely new skill, and new skills feel clumsy and effortful for a while before they start to feel natural. The fact that it feels effortful at first is not evidence that it isn't working. It's simply evidence that you're doing something your mind hasn't had much practice doing yet, which is exactly the condition under which any new capability, philosophical or otherwise, actually gets built. There's one more distinction worth drawing carefully, because it changes how this entire practice actually feels to live inside, and it addresses an objection that tend to come up naturally. Doesn't noticing what other people have accomplished serve a genuinely useful purpose sometimes, as inspiration, as a model to learn from, as evidence of what's actually possible? The Stoics would agree with this completely. And it points toward an important difference between two responses that can feel superficially similar in a moment, but that function in almost opposite ways over time. Envy and admiration. Envy, in the sense this episode has been describing, is fundamentally a comparison that diminishes you, a zero-sum accounting where someone else's success is quietly registered as evidence of your own relative shortfall. Admiration, by contrast, can hold someone else's accomplishment as genuinely impressive, genuinely worth learning from, without requiring that observation say anything at all about your own separate, independent worth or trajectory. The difference is not in what the other person has done. It's entirely in the internal posture you bring to observing it. The same promotion, the same beautiful vacation photo, the same impressive accomplishment can trigger either response. And learning to notice which one is actually happening in real time is itself a genuinely useful skill worth deliberately practicing. One practical way to tell the difference in the moment is to notice what question naturally follows the initial reaction. Envy tends to generate questions aimed inward and backward, comparative and often faintly resentful. Why don't I have that? What does this say about me? Why does it seem to come so easily to them and not to me? Admiration tends to generate questions aimed outward and forward, curious rather than comparative. How did they actually get there? What specifically did they do that I might genuinely learn from? Is there something useful here I could actually apply my own, entirely separate path? The content of what you're observing might be identical in both cases. The internal orientation, and consequently the actual usefulness of the reaction, is almost entirely different. This distinction becomes especially practical when applied specifically to the environment most responsible for supercharging comparison in the first place. Social media, and the specific, carefully engineered feeds that most people now check dozens of times a day, often without fully deciding to. It's worth being direct about something here rather than offering only abstract philosophy. These platforms are not neutral windows onto other people's lives. They are systems built by extremely well-resourced teams of engineers and designers, specifically optimized to maximize engagement and comparison, as uncomfortable as it feels, turns out to be remarkably effective at generating exactly the kind of compulsive checking behavior these systems are designed to produce. This isn't a conspiracy theory. It's simply an honest description of the underlying business incentive, and understanding it changes how you might reasonably choose to interact with these platforms, not by demonizing them entirely, but by approaching them with considerably more deliberate awareness than most people currently bring to the experience. A specific, practical technique here involves noticing your own physical and emotional state immediately before and immediately after scrolling through a feed for an extended period, treating this observation the same way you might track any other input that affects your well-being: food, sleep, exercise. Most people, if they actually pay honest attention to this, notice a fairly consistent pattern: a mild but real dip in mood and self-regard after extended scrolling, even when nothing specifically upsetting appeared in the feed, simply from the cumulative effect of dozens of small, unfair comparisons accumulating one after another, each individually minor, but adding up across an extended session to something genuinely corrosive. Noticing this pattern honestly doesn't necessarily require eliminating social media entirely, though some people do find that the most effective solution, at least for certain platforms or certain periods of their life. It might simply mean building in a deliberate pause before opening a feed, asking honestly what you're actually hoping to get from this particular session, and a similarly deliberate check afterward, noticing honestly how you actually feel, information that, over time, tends to naturally shift how much of this particular activity feels worth continuing versus worth deliberately reducing. There is, ultimately, no scoreboard being kept anywhere that meaningfully ranks the totality of one human life against another, no matter how convincingly various platforms, institutions, and cultural habits try to convince you otherwise. What exists instead, available to you and to no one else, is a specific, complete, honestly knowable record of your own trajectory, the actual distance between where you started and where you currently stand. That is the only comparison that was ever structurally capable of telling you the truth, and it remains at all times entirely within your reach.